Aren't videos supposed to automatically unmute this?
One job, Soda. One job.
Hello, everyone, and now that you can hear me, welcome to another edition of The Squared Slice. I am your friendly neighborhood soda, joined as always by my co-host, Dustin Dubuque. How are you doing today?
I'm splendid. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Just wondering why you keep turning your head looking off into the distance.
I know. I have my dogs out, so I had to turn the TV on. That's why. So then they don't bark or go crazy in the next hour. So I just had to turn on a movie in the background. So I'm all prepped and ready to go.
That's fair. And joining us once again on the show is none other than our very own Snark. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing pretty well, and I'm very excited about this. And this is one of the reasons why we did invite you to this episode. Dustin, I will let you make the introductions.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited. We have a friend of mine, George Shire, who a couple months ago, we did an episode on the AWA. We brought Snark on since he grew up watching it, and we thought it was awesome. And kind of once it all concluded, we had a good talk, and I was like, I just happen to know the guy who wrote the book on AWA wrestling, and I figured this would be a perfect time to try to get him on. As our viewers know, we once a month, Soda and I pick a match or an angle that we want to look at that shameless plug. That's the book.
Minnesota.
Adding it to the Amazon wish list.
Yeah, it's great. But yeah, so long story short, I figured why not, if we're going to do the territory thing again, why not have George pick a match, which he did, and then we'll talk AWA. But long story short, me and George have worked together before. He's a great author. I own all of his books, and I know he likes to talk AWA, very much so. So is that a good enough introduction, George? Is that about right?
It works for me. Hello. It works for me. I with regard to that shameless plug, it's interesting because I did the book on the AWA, and it was published by the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, the History Center. And they insisted when we got ready to publish that it be Minnesota's golden age of wrestling. And the reason they did that was because they're a Minnesota publisher and they wanted their name on it.
Makes sense.
I protested that originally, but I will tell you, we are 12 years into the publishing of this book. It came out in 2010. And I was at Barnes & Noble just this afternoon, and they are still on the shelves. And it's because it's Minnesota. And so it says Minnesota, but it's an AWA history, for those that are wondering about that. Mm-hmm. Because Minneapolis was the headquarters of the AWA, Minneapolis Wrestling Club. And everything that happened originated right here. So it's Minnesota's golden age of wrestling. And then what you read in there, it just it went around the circuit. So
sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just added it to the Amazon wish list, like if I want to get paid tomorrow.
Everyone should add it to their Amazon wish list. It's great. It really is. And George will talk about it more. But as a guy who's owned the book, I've gifted the book to anybody I know who watched AWA at one point. It is the definitive. Snark, we're getting there.
Yesterday, literally.
Oh, was it really? Well, we'll get you a book. I'm gonna make sure it happens. I promise. Yeah, it's great. It is insane the amount of work and stuff is in it that George has. And so I guess, George, the easy question is why the AWA? Why do you love it? And what gets you to the point where you're the guy who lives and breathes AWA still after all these years?
Well, I think the first question is why the AWA? I mean, I think it's logical because when I was 8 years old, I lived in St. Paul as a little kid. AWA was all we got. Now this goes back, you guys, because I'm old. This goes back to 1959, and in those days, we only had 4 channels on a TV set with those rabbit ears, and wrestling in every territory was the show that a lot of people watched. But here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, obviously, All-Star Wrestling was what I saw. And so naturally, that's my hometown, and it's what I was going to start watching, what I fell in love with. I mean, the long story short is I turned it on, and there was Tiny Mills, Stan Kowalski, Murder Incorporated, and they were beating up some poor slob on TV, and they were the bad guys. And as an 8-year-old kid, I said, wow, this is cool. And my parents were fighting in the kitchen. They were getting divorced. And so I needed something to fall into, and wrestling. And this is really the truth. I wouldn't bore you with my childhood and what happened with myself and siblings and the divorce. But wrestling was the one thing that I grabbed onto, and it became a crutch, became an addiction, and it saved me as a kid. I had nothing better to do than to find more wrestling, and AWA did it. So I didn't have to turn to drugs and gangs and whatever else that kids can do in situations. And that's it. Wrestling was it. So throughout the years, I was fortunate enough to get to know a lot of the wrestlers, travel with Marty O'Neill, who was one of our TV announcers for many decades. And after you get to know the guys and they sort of trust you, eventually it's tough to get in. But before you know it, I'm writing stories for national publication, wrestling magazines. I love journalism. I love broadcasting. And it just all came together. So now in wrestling itself, I've enjoyed doing wrestlers' results records, career records.
Okay.
Very interesting work, because back in that era when these guys were wrestling, 300 dates a year all over the country, and then, in the local territory that you're in, their results really tell stories about their careers. In some areas, they'd be a good guy. Another territory, they're a bad guy. One territory, they're wrestling under this name. Another territory, a different name, sometimes under a mask. I mean, it's very intriguing and entertaining. And they get to see how they turn on a partner and have a feud. And so results are what I really got into. And I started presenting results records after research in those early days of going to libraries and going through newspapers in towns I never knew even were towns, and looked at results. And, finally you get to just having fun with it. And so now I present records to the guys, and most of them, sadly, so many of my buddies have left us now, that they've passed away, but there it is. So that's kind of a nutshell how I think that answered your question, Dustin.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. You got a question?
Quick, did you ever feel the urge to actually go between the ropes yourself?
No, that's interesting. No. I had mentioned a minute ago that I enjoyed broadcasting. Mm-hmm. And when I was a little kid, I'd hold a microphone, a pretend microphone, and pretend I was Marty O'Neill, when I was in my teens. But if I was going to do anything at that point, it would have been I'd want to be a wrestling announcer. As I got towards the end of high school, I wanted to go into broadcasting. Mm-hmm. I went to Brown Institute, a school of broadcasting here in the Twin Cities back in the day. I did graduate. Never actually went into broadcasting from their viewpoint, but since I have been on the radio, I can't tell you how many times, doing not only wrestling shows, but wrestling interviews, mm-hmm. hosting shows, co-hosting shows. And I was telling a guy just the other day, he asked me, well, how many podcasts have you done? And I swear to God, I think in the past 10 years, I've probably done close to 3,000 or more podcasts, various wrestling podcasts.
That's commitment.
And it's it's fun. There are so many wrestling podcasts today. Everybody seems to have one. And I will go on and I will talk about any territory, because I have virtually programs, clippings, pictures, magazines from all the territories of the old days.
Oh, wow.
It was something that as a kid, I just kept collecting. I used to trade with people from different territories. And so, if you want to talk about Houston wrestling, I can do that. If you want to talk about Florida, I can do that. You want to California, I can do that.
You're like Yoda, because that's what I love. That's what I love. I love learning about the history of the business. More so, don't get me wrong, I love watching wrestling, but I'm at that point in my life where it's the history that matters to me more.
Yeah.
And so that's awesome.
And the thing is, guys, when you talk about the history, I was having a discussion the other day with a guy who was telling me that AEW that's out there today he said it's old school. You got to watch it. Well, I got news for you. And I actually tried it again tonight. I turned it on and I swear I was watching WWE. I realized there's a different definition of old school.
Right.
A lot of the fans that have been following wrestling since the 80s, mid 80s forward, well, all that stuff to them is old school now. But my definition of old school is before Vince McMahon fired the first bullet and started the promotional war and eventually tore down all the territories. And so when you go back to the early 80s, back to the 70s, 60s, 50s, and into the late 40s, that is old school because we had 25 to 30 different territories around the country, all running independently. And there were 3,000 or more wrestlers, pro wrestlers that were traveling around, making a living doing what they were doing. And then that doesn't count all of the enhancement talent, the jobbers, etc., in those territories. Yeah. Whereas today, you break it down and you have your WWE and your AEW and some of the independents, you got a couple hundred wrestlers that are making any money.
Yeah.
That's sad because there's no place for them to go if they're not with the WWE or the AEW or, again, some of those smaller promotions. If they don't work for them, they don't work.
Yeah.
And so the territories are gone. And so that's the long story short of what my definition of old school is. It was 85 and backwards. Yeah. I followed the AWA, sadly, to the bitter end of 1990 when it became a shell of what it once was. And there's so many stories that go along that route. And but for me, as a fellow follower of AWA, it was really was painful and like watching a dear friend or a relative just slowly pass away before me.
Oof.
And
if you've ever, I don't know if anybody's ever watched some of that late ESPN AWA.
It airs up here on ESPN Classic.
It is almost, you don't almost know what you're watching.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Do you remember that stuff, Snark? That late ESPN footage?
From the late 80s into the 90s and stuff like that, like even after the Rockers or the Midnight Rockers or whatever.
It was this crazy
too much of it. No, by that time I was living in small towns and I was out in Saskatchewan and stuff like that. So Winnipeg had switched over from AWA to WWF sometime around 1986, 1987. I think the last match here was in 1986. That's right. I think it was it was Flair versus Bockwinkel in a match. Bockwinkel wasn't the champ at that time, but Flair was, and I think it was a double count out if I remember right. I don't think anybody actually won that match. It was one of those ones where people would actually count to 10 and then you'd be tossed out. It wouldn't be count to 50 and all of a sudden get back in here, you guys. Quit fooling around.
Sorry.
Go ahead. I was saying, like that's about the end of it for me. Is it 1986? This is after Martel had won the title, and then Stan Hansen took it from him. Stan Hansen, one of the best guys on a mic ever.
Oh yeah.
I can't remember who Hansen had to drop it from. I think Larry Zbyszko may have been champion. Sometime
Zbyszko was the last champion.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He was the last one.
Yeah, but I like my era is that late 70s, early 80s when Andre the Giant would come in all the time. Hogan, Dino Bravo was there, the East-West connection, High Flyers, Jerry the Crusher Blackwell, not to mention the Crusher was also there, Baron von Raschke. Someone who can't be named.
Yeah. Now I know who.
It rhymes with the F word. So George, I don't want to talk about the bad part of AWA forever as we keep going on this, but I think the one question is that I would ask you, and I don't know if I ever asked you, is so you say like 85, right? When did you finally since you were so diehard into it and like you saw the Vince train coming and the WWF, What do you have a moment where you went, this is the death nail, this is it?
It's really funny because when Hulk Hogan left in '84, December of '84, and then we started to see that not only from the AWA, which was targeted the most from Vince McMahon, but also the other territories where wrestlers were departing and going east. And I started to see the trend right there because the territories were having trouble keeping their wrestlers. And it got to a point where with the AWA, interesting what people don't realize, and I have all the results and attendance records and everything from 85, 86, and 87, when Vince McMahon would come into the Minneapolis territory and run a card in opposition to Vern, Vern was still outdrawing him many times with the newer talent that he was using, like the Road Warriors and the Masked Superstar and King Tonga and, different guys like this. And the Midnight Rockers and the Fabulous Ones. So
yeah.
What really changed, though, was by the time we got to 87 and, into 88, Vince McMahon had pretty much closed down all the territories when he bought up all the TV times so that Vern wasn't able to have a TV station for his wrestling. He did this in all of the other territories as well. And then he would buy up the arenas so that the established promoter in a territory couldn't get the arena. And before you know it, the wrestlers were going there with big promises of contracts and, mighty salaries. And Vince was only doing it because he wanted to just take everybody and make it unable for the other, the regular promotions to run. So when I finally started falling off the tracks, at 87, and there was a Midnight Rockers, Doug Summers, Buddy Rose match that's very popular.
Yeah, the one where Michaels is bleeding like a stuck.
Oh yeah, it was
that one.
It was
Good
a
match.
Great match. It was a great match, and that was about the end of the road. I loved the Bockwinkel, Kurt Hennig matches. I mean, they were phenomenal. But after that, I started slowing off of the AWA and just started living in the past. And then I was slowly seeing territories dying. And the main thing that's different today is that, and this is something that I think we're going to talk about tonight, wrestling in the old era told stories, how to get to the match, in the match, and after the match. And most of wrestling today, if you watch every match on TV, there's no rhyme or reason why the moves are being done. And they don't even finish programs anymore. The feuds between the guys, guys are switching back and forth from heel to baby. And it just makes no sense.
The only one that I would say is the exception to that is the recent MJF CM Punk stuff, because has got to be feud of the year for me. Like, that was amazing storytelling, and then the finale was a dog collar match, and the stories told in that there was several different storylines weaving in and out, and it was so seamless. It was that, I think when people say old school, I think they might have been referring to that, like the storytelling, because some of them tell good stories, but. Yeah, I do agree with all your other points.
Well, and the other thing that's really interesting, too, is that in the era that I followed, when you talked about Stan Hansen being a great on the microphone, that was an era when those guys, the wrestlers, got on the microphone. They probably on TV had 2 to 3 minutes to sell themselves to the fan watching at home. And if they were a bad guy, they had to make you hate them. And if they were the baby face, they had to make you love them and want to hug them and go see them.
Right.
But the bottom line is they were given the town they were wrestling in. They were given the opponent they were going to be against. And they knew where they were in the program with that wrestler. And those guys, Stan Hansen, Nick Bockwinkel, Blackjack Lanza, Mad Dog Vachon, The Crusher, and we can go on and on. They went out and they talked for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and they ad-libbed the whole thing. They didn't have a script. And today, you got 20 minutes of a script in the ring where these wrestlers, they have to memorize this whole thing that the writers are giving them. And by the time you get done with 20 minutes, I'm like, what the hell have they said anything?
I agree. Like that is one of
so
my
true.
big issues with
So
WWE is the
that's
scripting.
the main difference. That they're more. But I just want to say this: anybody that's a modern day fan, Vince is making money, AEW is making money, and the fans are buying it and they're loving it. And this is your generation, and God bless you. Live it, enjoy it, but don't try to tell me that it's as good as what I lived. I've seen both sides of the fence, and I got news for you. The grass on the other side is mud. So there you go.
Oh gosh.
Why don't you ask me how I really feel?
Yeah, no kidding, eh?
I guess another question I have, then I'll let the other two boys take it. So when do you think AWA, like if you had to give like a little era, was that its, when's the peak? When is the exact time? Like what's the couple of years that this is when it's hot? I mean, it's, it's, to me, the AWA was hot for a long time in this, the little region it had, which was quite large.
As an outsider, to me, it looks like the era that Snark referenced is the one that was probably the peak.
As a younger guy, to me, I also would think like 76, 77, but maybe I'm wrong.
That's
so
my guess.
That would be my guess too.
The absolute with the AWA, if we're just going to concentrate on that, and keep in mind that wrestling was big all over the country,
right? With
the NWA and all the territories that represented their title, all of the independent promotions, etc. But with the AWA, as from a financial standpoint, 1981, 82, 83, 84 were the peak of financial success for the AWA. 82 was their best year ever, money-wise.
What was the big feud in '82?
You had Hulk Hogan and Bockwinkel and then Jesse and Adrian were here. A lot of people say, well, it's because Hulk Hogan was here. Oh yeah, that was a huge part of it. Yeah. But we were top heavy with how over the Sheikh was, Adnan Casey.
Oh yeah.
Really?
With the Iraq situation, and he was so over as a heel. And then you had Jerry Blackwell, who was the turncoat and become a Sheikh himself, Sheikh Ayatollah Jerry Blackwell.
So good.
We had Dr. David Schultz. We had Nick Bockwinkel, and Nick. And I want to clear this up for folks too. People say to me all the time, "Well, if Vern would have put the title on Hulk, Hulk wouldn't have left." And I've had wrestlers themselves agree with this. No, he wouldn't. Vern did not put the title on Hogan for one reason. He was drawing so good with Heenan and Bockwinkel as a combination. And Nick was over. And when Nick wrestled Hogan in all these towns, it was Nick that made Hogan look so good.
Agreed.
This is fact, guys.
Yeah.
Hogan was not a wrestler in the sense of the wrestlers I grew up with.
He's never really been a technical
great showman. He was had charisma. He identified with the fans. But when he got in his matches in those years, it was Bockwinkel and Heenan that made him look so good. And it was Dr. D. David Schultz in their feud with Hogan. And they were good buddies outside the ring.
Yeah, I heard that, yeah.
In fact, when Hogan left with Vince, he told Vince, I want Schultz to come.
He brought Schultz with him, didn't he?
Yeah. And that didn't last long, did it?
Yeah, I read that in Schultz's book.
That's a whole different story. Yeah. But the bottom line is, Vern was not going to put the title on Hogan because with or without the title, Hogan would have went to Vince because Vince needed Hogan's charisma to pull off this promotional expansion war and go national like he did. But Hogan was a huge part of the success. But all those other guys, Jesse and Adrian, the High Flyers, Rick Martel, Dino Bravo, as you mentioned, Bruiser Brody.
Yep.
Tony Atlas. I mean, there were so many guys here in 82, 83, 81. And that is what was making the AWA so successful. The other thing I'm going to point out to you, and this true, any wrestler of any merit throughout the entire history of the AWA, they wanted to come and work in the AWA territory because in those days, Vern was a good payoff guy.
Yeah.
Vern Gagne and Wally Carbo. And the territory had a great schedule where the guys they'd end up working 6 months a year. I mean, they didn't take 6 months off, but they would have a 3-day or a 4-day week, and they'd have long weekends.
Oh.
They a lot of times the AWA lowered the schedule in the summertime because people in Minnesota and Wisconsin and North Dakota, South Dakota, Chicago, Illinois, when the summer comes, we get 4 weeks of summer before it turns into hell again.
I know.
And people don't want to go inside, so they didn't go to matches. So normally they wouldn't promote, a lot during the last part of June into the early part of August. So the guys had a great schedule. And the best example of that is when Nick Bockwinkel was world champion. At the height of his championship, now this is back in the late 70s, early 80s, so tie that into when I say this.
Okay.
Nick was making about $275,000 a year. Now that's huge money still today, but back then that was big. And Harley Race, who was the NWA champion, was working 375, 80 times a year, and there's only 365 days in the year. He was working a solid schedule going around the country as champion NWA, and Harley was making the same money. So you figure it out.
Yeah.
Nick was wrestling half the time, and Nick said himself, he said, when I got offered to go to the NWA, I put it to paper and I said I'd be an idiot.
Right.
So the AWA it was a talent haven. You could only have so many guys, at a certain time in a territory. But anybody who was anybody in the business, if you asked them, they'd say, I wanted to work for Vern. And when I worked for Vern, I made good money.
And like on the flip side, like think how many of the all-time greats he trained. Like, was the foremost trainer.
Vern Gagne brought over 100 guys into the business. And if you look at the names of the guys that he brought in, the Blackjacks, the Anderson brothers, Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Larry Hennig, Baron von Raschke. And, then we can go down the list and say the High Flyers and Ken Patera and Chris Taylor.
Iron Sheik.
And Iron Sheik.
Oh, yes.
And he brought in Brad Rangans.
Yeah.
Larry Hennig, I mentioned. He brought in Bulldog Bob Brown. The names are endless. Just absolutely endless.
Yeah, they listed I've got the
Jimmy Valiant, Boogie Woogie Man. He brought him into the business.
And
I was just watching an interview with him this morning.
That's funny.
Jimmy Valiant. Now we're gonna get him on my podcast here soon.
Cool.
We're negotiating with him. So
I've only got the AWA WWE DVD, and when they listed all the names that came from there, I was like, holy crow! Man, that's impressive.
Was that a barn that he trained them in? It was a barn, right?
It was a barn,
yeah. He had an old barn out in Mound where he was living at the time. Had no heat or no air conditioning in the thing, and he'd be in there in the heat of the summer, and he'd be training the guys. And Vern was very stubborn in that he wanted, because Vern was an amateur wrestler himself. He was a football player, an amateur wrestler. And then he went on to be an alternate in the Olympics for amateur wrestling. So Vern always wanted wrestling to be presented as real. And his whole idea was, I want you to know how to wrestle first and be believable. And then if you need a character, we'll work on that later.
Right.
But he wanted you to know how to wrestle. And it was important for Vern to have wrestlers, Nick Bockwinkel being one of them, that when he put the title on him, he wanted Nick to be able to protect that title in case there was a wrestler that would come in and try to get cute and say, I'm going to see how tough the guy is. And guys did that back then.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised.
And that's the reason that the National Wrestling Alliance and Vern Gagne always had wrestlers over characters as their champion. You say, well, Mad Dog Vachon, he held the title for 3 years in the 60s. But Mad Dog was a great amateur wrestler. He just used this Mad Dog gimmick to really get over. And him as champion, Vern never had to worry about somebody testing him. Same with Nick. Now with Billy Robinson, and we can clear that one up too. Why didn't Billy get the title? Well, it's a very simple answer. Billy was one of those guys that, as good as he was, as great as he was, and I don't think there's anybody that could really beat Billy Robinson if Billy didn't want to be beat. That's the truth. But
he was a legit tough guy.
But exactly. But if Billy thought you weren't respecting him, or if he didn't like you, he wouldn't work for you for anything. He'd make you look silly. And so Vern, excuse me, Vern always had to worry about Billy, and that if he put the title on Billy Robinson, whoever Billy's challengers would be, if Billy didn't want to lose on a given night and he was asked to, it would have been a disaster. Whereas a guy like Nick, Vern would just say, hey, Nick, I'm thinking about taking the title off you. We're going to do this, this, and that. Yeah, okay, whatever, and Nick would go out and do it.
One of the things I'd always heard was that promoters in the old days would always put the title on on people they trust. So that's
your answer right there.
Yeah.
Now, Vern was close friends with Billy, but he had that time where he didn't totally trust Billy, in the sense that if he asked Billy to lose, it could have been a disaster. And, here's the thing. Guys in the wrestling business, they have to realize that first and foremost, any title in any territory belongs to the promoter, or it belongs to whoever runs the territory. In this case, it's Vern Gagne's title. When Vern went into Stan Hansen and told him that, we're having issues with this Japan deal you're doing, and, we agreed we'd share the commitments, but you're going to be gone for 8 weeks. I'm not going to have you. I want you to drop the title to Nick and go over to Japan and do your thing. And Stan said, screw you. I'm not going to do it. Well, there you got a problem, because the employee is telling the boss, I'm not going to do what you asked me to do. Right. And I don't know. I worked in banking for 35 years, and I had to do what the owner of the bank said.
Of course.
Unless it's illegal, but I have a choice. I can not do it and leave, or I can do what they ask me to do. And that's the way it works in the world. And
you can't run over the bank, George, like run over the bell.
Right. But in the case of some of these wrestlers, they I think their ego gets the best of them, and they don't want to do the job when the promoter asks them to, for whatever reason. And that's where problems came in. But in that era that we're talking about, the promotion generally ran very smooth, and Nick and Bobby Heenan together was just such a magic marriage.
Oh my God!
I mean, Vern could, no matter who went against them, Vern had magic at the gate, and Hulk Hogan was one of them.
When growing up, I'm an WWF kid growing up. So for me, I grew up Bobby Heenan with Mr. Perfect, Bobby Heenan with Andre the Giant, whatever. But when I saw Bobby Heenan and Nick Bockwinkel, I'm like, now that is magic. Yeah, that's magic.
Bobby in general, George and Snark too. You guys got to see it before me and Soda were alive. But even when I talk to, and George, you probably know, I have friends that are indie guys or wrestled a long time, and they're super jaded to wrestling, but if there's one constant guy, or guys really, that are never spoken about in any other capacity than what you're saying, it always feels it's Bockwinkel and Heenan. Everybody's on board. And how rare is that to find in wrestling?
Yeah.
Where everyone's on board that these guys were way better at their jobs than most everybody else.
I'll tell you how good Bobby Heenan was. In 1981, when Vern Gagne retired as champion, and then he put the title on Nick without a tournament or anything. He just said because they had Stanley Blackburn, the figurehead president.
Yeah.
But the title was given back to Nick. There were a lot of fans that were so upset about that. Average fans that said, well, they should have had a tournament and Nick should have had to beat somebody to win the title. And yeah, that makes sense. But here was the rationale. Nick was the guy to go to for Vern to put the title back on him. And he did it because of loyalty. Vern was loyal to Nick, and Nick was loyal to Vern. They had a series of matches that summer after Vern retired. Nick in 4 matches in each of the territory cities in the AWA, had a match against Sheikh Adnan Al-Kaisi. Now, here's the deal, guys. The Sheikh was so hated. I mean, he was going to win the title and he was going to take it back to Iraq, and we were never going to have a champion again. And, you know, he was going to ask big money for him to defend the title. You know, he's playing the gimmick to the hilt.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Vern did a very genius thing. When Nick Bockwinkel came to the ring for the very first match in each city with his match with Sheikh, in order for the fans to cheer for Nick, they had the Sheikh take Bobby Heenan out in the matches. He immediately went over and attacked him, bloodied him up, and they carried Heenan out. Now, the fans are then rooting for Nick because, one, they don't want the title to leave America, you know, heaven forbid. And the Sheikh was more evil. And then Bobby Heenan was out of the picture. Now, Vern knew that if he left Heenan in, I'm not saying this would have happened, but I absolutely think that Sheikh could have gotten cheers because it would have been 2-on-1 and Bobby Heenan was part of it. Yeah. Bobby was so over as a heel. He would never be a babyface. He never was, and he didn't want to be. And so Vern did the great thing. And so then in those matches, the fans are yelling, USA, USA, because they wanted Nick to save the title. Now, when those series of matches were over, they were done with it. They had a feud a program at the end of the feud where Von Raschke was the special referee, and Sheikh accidentally hit Raschke. So now Raschke's going to have a feud with Baron, and now Nick goes on to defend the title against other fellow baby faces. But it achieved the purpose where the fans had forgotten how Nick was handed the title.
Right.
That's genius promoting. That is storyline when you see how it was put together. And now the fans are back booing Heenan and Bockwinkel so that guys like Bravo and Santana and the Flyers and Martel don't get the title. Beautiful.
Sheikh, that's General Adnan, correct?
Adnan Al-Kaisi.
Yeah.
His real name's Adnan Al-Kaisi.
Okay, yeah, I know him from the 1990s.
Yep, General
Adnan, yeah.
And he is really from Iraq. That's legit.
I told Soda this. Read his book. Great book.
Yeah, Sheik's got a great book. It was done by my friend Ross Bernstein. Mm-hmm. And the thing with the Sheik is when he went to the WWF back in the 70s, he was wrestling as a Native American, Billy White Wolf.
White Wolf, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, Billy White Wolf, who was teamed with Jay Strongbow, and they were champs over there for a while.
The Billy White Wolf stuff's super interesting because you don't even notice that it's Adnan.
No, he's got the full, headdress,
the turban thing on.
Everything.
Really?
Yeah. So Billy White Wolf in the WWF, and then he'd use that name in Texas and the Pacific Northwest territory as well as Billy White Wolf. And he was always a babyface.
It wasn't until you said that they were champs, and I was like, wait, I've heard of him. I didn't realize that was the same guy.
Yeah, Billy White Wolf and Jay Strongbow. And of course, Jay Strongbow wasn't a real Indian either.
Right, yeah.
He's Joe Scarpa, an Italian. But when he came in 71, I don't know why we're talking about this guy, but when he came in 71, Vince Sr. did not want another Italian, so he made it. And he couldn't get Wahoo McDaniel at the time. That was a story.
Yeah, because I was going to say Wahoo's the only true Native American under the three.
So Jay Strongbow came in and finished out his career. Now let's go back to the AWA.
That's actually a pretty good transition. Let's get into the match now.
Yeah. So why is this the match, George? Why is this the one when we said? Well, the only parameter I give George is we had to be able to see it, so easily accessible. So we needed it on Peacock or on YouTube or something. So other than that, this is what you sent, George. Why is this it?
Well, the match that you're talking about was a TV match, All Star Wrestling, and it took place on October 6th of 1973, and it was Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens as the champions, and they came into the ring. And in those days, guys, generally a TV match was a main star versus one of the, as they call them, the jobbers.
Yeah.
The enhancement talent.
It was all just to put the main wrestler over, and then he'd go out and do his 2-minute interview and get you to come to see him in the arena. So Nick and Ray come into the ring, and then on the other side, lo and behold, here come Red Bastien and Billy Robinson. Well, Nick and Ray played it up perfectly. No, wait a minute here. You know, we didn't sign to wrestle these guys, and we're the champions. We're not prepared to wrestle guys of this caliber. Wally Carbo comes in, says, you know, on that, all the contracts you signed that you agreed to wrestle. What are you talking about? Bockwinkel says. Well, in the small print, you know, their names were on there. And of course, there weren't even really contracts.
No. You look at somebody's blank piece of paper or somebody's laundry.
Yeah. So Nick, you know, Billy and Red, and you know, you talk about two great babyface wrestlers. I mean, Billy Robinson, his matches, singles and tag teams with Nick Bockwinkel, I have seen so many of them, and I never saw a bad one. And they were always different. I mean, two guys that just were magic together. Mm-hmm. And I'll sidetrack and tell you guys that when I told you about some wrestlers who don't want to do the job or they don't want to do things, Nick Bockwinkel told me, I asked him, I said, how did you get along with Billy? And he said it was very simple. Before the match, I'd go into the locker room and I'd say, well, William, what do you want to do tonight? You know, what do you want to do in our match? And he said, you let Billy have that respect and you let him just say, you know, we'll do this, and whatever. And, you know, we knew the result. Nick was probably going to win. Mm-hmm. But he said, as long as you gave Billy that respect, he would work with you. And, you know, if you weren't a good wrestler, he made you look like you were the best wrestler in the world. And that was the quality of Nick Bockwinkel as well. Mm-hmm. Nick would make a broomstick look good. Mm-hmm. Literally, with the ring with the broomstick, and you'd think the broomstick should be the champion. Yeah. And that was how it was worked. So with Red Bastien as Billy's partner, Red Bastien at that time in his career, 73, a couple years before, 74, he was a phenomenal worker. And Minneapolis-born wrestler, high flyer. He made it look so easy, so real, and putting them together as a team was a genius move. So that's where that TV match came about.
Okay. Yeah, Red Bastien's a name I'd only ever heard. This is the first time I'd ever seen anything of him, and I was very impressed.
It's the first time I'd ever seen anything of him either. I've heard of him, of course, because I knew that he was wrestling. He'd been wrestling in the AWA for a long time. I was very impressed at how agile he was. He looks like a big man, and he looks like he could get up and down no problem.
Yeah. I know we're gonna get into it, but like rewatching the match. First off, I messaged Soda and Snuck today when I watched it. You know, before we get into the match, because I do want to talk about. I couldn't believe some of the things Bastien was pulling off in '73. Like, it was pretty awesome. Actually, I was like, God, this guy. He looks like he's a schlub. Mm-hmm. And he's doing some great stuff. This thing, I know, like, of course. Yeah. But could anybody? Sorry, you can go on that in a sec, George. But does the one thing about Bockwinkel? I know people probably say it a little too much in wrestling, but like, is there a guy who physically? I said this to Soda today, who literally could work today. Like, when I see Bockwinkel, just how he looks, how he sounds, how he speaks. Mm-hmm. And just like who he is, I think of him and I go, Bockwinkel could do this if he was this age in 2022. Like, I think it would work.
Yeah. Could you imagine like a Bockwinkel MJF?
Yeah. Like there is something about him that because again, you know, I'm younger, Soda's younger. You know, when we watch the older stuff, sometimes, Snark, you're beautiful.
Oh, come on.
But sometimes the older stuff, you know, it doesn't, you know, it's like anything. It doesn't it's like an old movie or an old TV show. The gap is there, right? But some talent that I watch that's, you know, from 1973 just fits. And I'm like, this is so smooth and so good. And it's like, this is really good.
And you
everything about Bockwinkel is that.
And you can see their impact, like none other. Like if you look, Chris Jericho, 15 years ago when he did his Nick Bockwinkel-esque heel turn, and Keith Lee talks like Bockwinkel, like the dude sounds smart.
$40.
If you booked him like a Bockwinkel, dude would be an all-star.
You have to realize, guys, that Chris Jericho was kind of a throwback. He was still he was trained for the business when old school was still around, and he was a very, very good example of somebody that was able to move forward, into the newer generation.
Still doing it.
Here's the thing with Nick Bockwinkel. It's any of the 4 wrestlers in that tag match that we're talking about. If you looked at wrestling, if you wanted to compare the 2 eras, if you looked at wrestling in the tag team match era we're talking about, every wrestler had their own unique type of style. Billy Robinson was the wrestler that could put you in 15 holds in 15 seconds and twist you into pieces. And Red Bastien was the high flyer. He'd head scissors. He'd drop you down, drop kick you, and it all looked so real. And then you had Bockwinkel, who was a good technical wrestler who could work with the best of them. And then you had Ray Stevens, who was just crazy phenomenal in the ring. But the key thing is that if you look at I turned on AEW about a month ago, and they had a tag team match. And as the 4 guys came into the ring, 2 of them were the Hardy Boys, Hardy Brothers or whatever. As they came into the ring, the problem is that number 1, they all looked alike. All 4 wrestlers. They're all tattooed. They've all got the ear piercings, the heads shaved or long hair. They've all got the same ring outfits on. There is no definition as to who is the good guy and who is the bad guy.
Right.
I mean, as an onlooker, I couldn't tell.
Yeah, that's very modern wrestling.
They're all yelling and screaming. They all got the same interview. Yeah. And see, that's the difference. In my era, it was, as they say, black and white.
I really do think you'd like MJF then.
Blackjack Lanza was a bad guy because he wore a black hat, black vest, and black boots. And Cowboy Bill Watts was a cowboy wrestler, but he had a white hat, and he was, the good guy.
Yeah.
They were different. You didn't have 4 blonde wrestlers going against each other in our era. You didn't have 4 masked men going against each other. Everybody had a definition. And that really made the difference. And that's what made all the territories, and especially the AWA, so unique. So the fans are able to immediately, when you got the Sheikh, Adnan Casey, well, he's the heel. Look at him. He's Jerry Blackwell, you big fat slob. And he's going at it, and he's going to take the title to Iraq. And he's the bad guy. When you look at Rick Martel in comparison to the Sheikh, well, Rick Martel, he looks like mom's apple pie good guy. Yeah, he's your neighbor that would be out cutting the lawn.
Mom's poutine.
Totally.
Yeah, right.
So that's the major difference. If you can put that definition in there, wrestling today is just not the same product, and it's not presented the same way.
Oh, of course.
Well, of course, yeah.
I don't think anybody can argue that, and you're definitely not wrong about how there's really no clean-cut good guy or bad guy. Like, there are the few exceptions, like I brought him up a few times. MGF, clearly a heel. That guy is like the modern-day Roddy Piper. But yeah, other than that, it's hard to find one who's like a very, very clear-cut. Like, even Hangman Adam Page is the champ. Like, he still does heelish things.
Well, even again, I know we'll get back to the match here quick, but when AEW was first started, and Soda, you were there, when Cody Rhodes was first talking, he said there was no heel and baby faces.
Yeah.
He openly said that when it started. He's like, we're past that. He's like, let's stop pretending that this is how it is. You just cheer for
now. Didn't he just quit the company and he's moving over to WWE?
Yeah, he did it already.
Yeah, there's disputes going on. We don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, let's not. But more about the match that's super fun and fast and interesting. Can I just throw it out there? Look, can we keep
3 falls?
I was just gonna say that the 2. I wasn't even prepared for that. Maybe I missed it.
Yeah, me neither.
the 2 out of 3 falls aspect of it.
Oh my
that's
gosh.
like the shocking part of it, right? I'm assuming.
Well, see, here's the thing. If you looked at that tag team match, a 2 out of 3 fall tag team match was so special from the late 40s all the way through, because in that tag team match there are several stories that are being told. You know, the in a lot of cases the bad guy team would win the first fall in a tag team match.
Sure.
And the reason they'd win it is because now the fans immediately want to see the baby faces get revenge in fall number 2. But they could play it so well because the heels would win, and then the referee they'd have a 20-second or a 30-second timeout. You know, each team goes to their corner. A lot of times the baby faces beat up in the middle of the ring because they got double teamed, and he got pinned or was hit from behind by that proverbial foreign object that the referee missed because he was busy buying popcorn. And so the bad guys then, the good guy will try to come in. The bad guys will then beat up again on the baby face on the ring apron, and he doesn't get time to recover. So there's a story there in between falls. Then you're going to have your second fall, and the good guy team usually would win that one. And then you get to the third fall, and that's where the story is going to finally be told.
Right.
If it was the champions, in this case, Nick and Ray, well, they're not going to lose the title probably that night, so they're going to get disqualified. Or the referee's going to see them do something that they shouldn't have done. Or sometimes they'll disqualify the good guys who have been, they've had enough of getting double teamed and, this whole thing. So they get in there and they both reckon it, and the referee just throws the match out. Well, then they got to have a rematch because the fans went home believing that the good guys could beat them because they got disqualified trying, and you have a rematch. So it's all about building the story. That match on TV with Nick and Ray and Bastien and Robinson, that match was simply done to bring those two teams together so that they could run it around the horn, because Red and Billy won 2 straight falls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was interesting.
And so we've proven we can beat them. Red Bastien on the interview afterwards, he said, we proved we could beat them, Marty.
Yeah.
Marty O'Neill. He says, we proved we can beat them, and now we want to have a match with them for the title. And Nick and Ray, they're livid. They threw these rookies or these ringers at us. We weren't prepared for them. We're not giving them a match. Well, the promoter can come out and say, look, you're the champions. You'll defend. If you don't defend, we're going to suspend you. Yeah. What do you mean you'll suspend us? I mean, it's all drama, all told so beautifully.
Wally Carbo and the championship committee. I love it.
Oh, yeah. I don't know how many were on there. I always loved it when Stanley Blackburn reviewed the films. And every match I ever attended, there wasn't a film camera or anything in place. But I think maybe, Stanley had a special hookup in Amarillo where he was able to see it.
That's nice.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite things to go back and watch about the older matches, because you're right. It's the storytelling that makes the difference. And there was some really good storytelling. I'm wearing the Mega Power shirt because that's one of my favorite storylines of all time, because it played out over a year. Those are the type of things I like.
So did anybody ever tell you, to me, you look like Curly Joe of the Three Stooges?
Yes, that's what
I don't mean that as a slam. I'm sitting here looking at you and I'm saying, holy cow, I'm having an interview with
actually, I've got a picture of me like just no hair, and I looked at that and I was like, never again.
I've been watching the Three Stooges on TV.
I've got all their shorts in a box set. I grew up on the Stooges.
There you go.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, the one thing, and I want to bring it up with Snark again too, is and again, Bastien, I think for the three of us, I know him obviously because I just, I'm an AWA fan, but not much. And I don't know, maybe going into this, that was the most fun part about watching this for a younger perspective, was watching how good Bastien and how, again, in 73, I don't know if it's the perspective of a younger guy, of the ending to that one fall where he takes the back body drop, lands on his feet, turns around, does a drop kick. And I'm like, that is still awesome. I'm like, that was spectacular.
I would say that to anybody that's listening to us here, if you really want to have, and this is why I picked this match when Dustin mentioned it. If you really want to go to YouTube and you look up, Bockwinkel Stevens versus Robinson and Bastien, and the date on it, I don't know if it's on YouTube, but it is October 6th from 73. But that match, that will tell you what old school wrestling was like. It had everything in it. It had the drama. It had the storyline of we're not going to defend, that you're throwing them at us. We beat them. Let's get a real match and beat them for real. And I mean, it was great. I want to tell you about Red Bastien.
Sure. Oh, sure.
Good. That was my question.
One of my Nick Bockwinkel on the other side, but Red Bastien was one of my closest friends outside of the ring.
Oh.
And Red Bastien was the very first wrestler that allowed me to come into the locker room with him in 1969. And that was when I truly learned what kayfabe was.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Come on in with me." And I walked through the door, and all the wrestlers that were in there, as soon as they saw me, this 17-year-old kid, whatever I was 17, it was silent. The proverbial hear a pin drop?
Yeah.
Quiet. And Bastien said, "Hey, the kid's okay." They started talking again. Everything was
all
cool.
you need is the
But
one.
he was the first guy, and he was such a fun guy. Outside the ring, we used to talk a lot. He'd call me on the phone just to talk, and every time I'd say to him, "Hey, Red, how you doing?" "Well, I'm staying ahead of the sheriff." That would be it. I had him over to my house one time, and one of my favorite stories. He and I sat out on my deck, shared a beer together, a couple beers. We came in the house. I was barbecuing steaks. My wife made some, the trimmings to the steak and had a dessert. We came in the house, sat down. We were going to eat. I plopped this big steak on his plate, all the food that's there. And Red reaches over and grabs his cherry pie that my wife had made and starts eating it. And I went, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, life is short. I eat my dessert first."
I like that.
And I love it. I said, "Man, I agree with you." So we had pie together before we ate our meal. And that was great. And so he was just one of my best friends outside the ring and just a great guy. And I had a chance to also present him with a 1-loss record for him. And he had such a great career. He was so good all over the world, the country, matches in Florida, Texas, California. I mean, he was such a phenomenal worker. You could go on YouTube if there's a match between him and Johnny Valentine. Oh my God, it is great. I mean, him and Valentine made it. If you didn't believe if it was real and you didn't believe it, they made you believe.
I'll have to look that one up.
Nick Bockwinkel on the other side. Again, one of my best friends. And he used to call me all the time too. And I missed those calls. And we'd talk 45 minutes to an hour. And, he left us a few years ago. So, but yeah, just 4 great guys.
Yeah.
Absolutely 4 great guys.
Bockwinkel is on my personal Mount Rushmore. I've really come to appreciate him in the last few years, watching him work and stuff like that. And my first exposure to him was when he was president of the WCW in the 90s. That's how I first.
And that was a figurehead Stanley Blackburn type post.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming he was just as articulate outside of the ring.
He had the suit on and everything. He looked the part.
Right.
Well, see, Nick was the guy when he was the heavyweight champion of, the AWA champion. Most of the time he wore a suit, sport coat, slacks. If you look at the champions today, they're wearing, God only knows what the hell they have on, and they got the belt over their shoulder like it's they don't wear it. I mean, they don't look like a champion. That was important in the old school days. Guys like Lou Thez, Vern Gagne, Pat O'Connor, and Nick Bockwinkel, Harley Race, the NWA champion. They always had to carry themselves in a professional way because they were the champion.
Right.
So they wore suits and Jack Briscoe, all those guys when they were champs. They Gene Kaniski when he was NWA champ, you always saw him in a suit when he came in to the arena. they carried the title really well.
I didn't realize that went that far when it comes.
Oh yeah, it was. Lou Thez was, if you ask any fan, any real true old school fan, who is the epitome of the old school wrestling, Lou Thez is the man. And the thing with Lou Thez, he was a lot like Billy Robinson, not trained in the same way. But Lou Thez was a hooker in the ring, a shooter. You didn't want to tick him off because Lou Thez was like Billy. You tick him off, and he's going to make you look like puke.
I heard that it was like that right up until the very end, too.
Yeah. Because he respected the business, and he didn't like characters in the business. The cartoon characters.
Very anti that when it started.
Yeah, and part of it, you say, well, come on, you got to loosen up a little bit. But on the same token, it's because he had such a great respect for the business. And in that era, when those wrestlers, they would go to their graves to tell you that it wasn't real. A quote in my book, and Dustin, it's in the introduction. When I talk, I say to people in the book, was it real? Was it fake? Or was it something else? And that something else is what we describe in the book. And that's what it was. The something else was, if you want to look at it this way, it was a lot like that magician who is pulling a rabbit out of the hat. You know he's not really doing this, but he's not telling you how he's doing it.
You're buying into it.
You're buying into it.
Yeah.
And the wrestlers of that era, they hated that word fake so much. All the years that I have went to Cauliflower Alley and knowing all the old school wrestlers, you look at them, there's, in this case, they were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. They can barely walk. They've had their ankles fused. They've had knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder replacements, surgeries, broken ribs, noses broken, eye sockets, the eyes taken out of the socket. I mean, you look at these guys and you go, holy crap. And then they look at you and they say, and this was fake. Fans don't get it. All the stuff they did to make it look real. And they do this, and that somebody will come up and say, well, you're a fake. Nick Kozak, he was an old Texas wrestler. He finally said to fans, he would say, for those of you who believe, no explanation is necessary. For those of you who don't believe, no explanation will do. And then in my book, I added one line myself. I said that wrestling was a lot like Santa Claus. It's more fun when you believe.
Of course.
True. It's true.
And I'll tell you what, there really is a Santa Claus. I have my daughter's 42 now, but my youngest daughter. But when she was 3 years old, she was 4 years old. We had Santa come to our house one night for Christmas Eve. Now, I don't know who the dude was. I had a friend recommend him. Honest to God, he was a perfect Santa. He was. He looked real. I still never saw it without it. But here was the deal. This is that believe part with wrestling. He played with my girls. We had some presents there. He gave them presents. One of the girls, my older daughter, asked, where are the reindeer? He said, I've got them up at the corner because I have to do the whole block. He had the answers. And then he said, well, now it's time for you to go to bed. And he said, you go upstairs and go to bed and be good little girls. And they wanted to see the sleigh, the little one, the 4-year-old. He said, you go up and you look out your window and you'll see the sleigh. And I went, oh my God, I'm thinking to myself, I said to my wife, I says, how are we going to pull this one off? I mean, come on. Well, my daughter, they went upstairs, they got in their beds. The 4-year-old looks out the window and I'm sitting there thinking, this is disaster. She believed because she just spent time with them. And finally, I swear to God, you guys, she said, there he is, Amy. There it is. I see him. And I looked at my wife and I said, she really does see the sleigh.
Right.
That was it was a great moment for us as a parent. But in her world, that moment, she saw that sleigh. So, wrestling, they did so much to make you believe. I used to sit next to fans. They'd say, well, this stuff is fake. And then all of a sudden there'd be a match and they go, well, now that one's real. They really don't like it. And I would think well, you can't pick and choose, but the bottom line was, yes, it was prearranged. They were in the ring to protect each other, take care of each other. And so going back to our, notice how I'm going to bring this back home, to our Billy, Red, Nick, Ray tag team match. Those guys had such a respect for each other, the four of them. The history between Red Bastien and Ray Stevens alone, outside the ring, they were like this. They were the best of friends, always on opposite sides in the ring. Red had wrestled against Ray Stevens hundreds of times. Red with his wrestling brother Lou back in the early 60s would wrestle against Ray when he was Ray Shire as Roy and Roy Shire, the Shire brothers. They're not related to me.
Yeah.
Vern Gagne thought that Roy was my uncle, but they're not related. But Ray and Roy Shire wrestled against the Bastiens dozens of times. Ray wrestled against Red in singles matches. And they had Nick and Red Bastien matches over the years. Outside the ring, they were three of the best friends you could ever meet. Billy fit into that mode because they had all gotten close in the AWA.
Yeah.
So you got four guys who totally love each other as friends outside. They respect each other. And when they go in the ring, they love working together. They didn't even need to talk in the ring. They just knew what each other, and if they did, it was one little code word or one little thing like, drop kick or something, but they knew what they were doing and they made it all look so real. And when the matches were over, you wanted to see more.
Yeah.
And that was the whole story. And Vern Gagne always summed it up the best. He said, when we do TV and these guys do their interviews and we have a match to get you to come to the arena, he said, we got to get you there. But when you're in the arena, we have to give you a reason to want to come back next time. And that's why you have the shenanigans in the arena where somebody interfered in the match, the referee didn't see the tag, the foreign object happened, everybody in the audience saw it, but the referee. So you got to have and the fans want to come back because they know the good guy got screwed, so we got to come back. Yeah. It's all soap opera. And it will never be that way again.
No, but there'll never be anything like it. Ever.
Can you tell I'm passionate?
We love it, George. I know, George, you've been on an hour, and I'm just like, there's so much more I want to talk about.
Yeah,
so I feel like
I'm sitting under the learning tree.
I know. I'm just like, oh my gosh, that was the fastest hour ever. We barely got a chance to ask all the questions about all the other things. So
when I was at the Washington County thing 2 weeks ago, Dustin, they only planned on going an hour. We did 2 hours and 20 minutes, and Brent Peterson said, we've got to close up. We got to close the building.
Yeah.
And the fans, we had 42 people that were there that night. Now, that's a pretty good crowd for a Tuesday ugly Minnesota night. It was raining and snowing. And when Brent said that, they booed him. So
the ultimate heel.
We were having fun. Very fun.
Nice.
Well, we'll definitely have you on again, George.
Of course.
Because I need to talk with Mad Dog Vachon and all the other fun people.
And so many of these guys were my friends. I love telling personal stories too.
I'm really.
I got some good Mad Dog personal stories.
That's the next episode.
That's
we'll do another time.
Because my dad loves Mad Dog Vachon because he is from that era and French Canadian.
It's a dog-eat-dog world.
Yeah.
That's all we'll need to know.
We'll hold that off. We know our next episode. Now we know.
Watch AWA Unleashed.
There you go.
There you go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Soda, do your plug and all the.
All right, well, yeah, George, thank you very much for joining us. Like I said, this was great.
Soda Snarkwinkle. Crusher would call you Jerkwinkle, Hoodwinkle, Snarkwinkle.
I'd love it.
There you go.
But yes,
hey guys, I had fun. Thank you.
Me too. It's like sitting under the learning tree. I just love hearing about something I'm so in love with. It's awesome.
Well, I've only just begun, so.
Right on. Well, tell us where everybody can find you, George.
You can find me. First of all, I say again, watch AWA Unleashed. We drop a new episode every Tuesday. And there are, I think, 14 of them out there now. So there's a new one. You got plenty to see.
On YouTube?
You can find me on Facebook. And if you're interested, join George Shire's Wrestling Time Machine. It's all old school. And then there's an AWA, American Wrestling Alliance board that I am in charge of. Join that. So enter a join and come on. And then go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon and get this book. And Soda, if you contact me off the air, I'll see that you get a copy.
Oh, right on.
And if Snarkwinkle, Jerkwinkle, Hoodwinkle has an ass, so I don't know if he's going to get one or not.
Oh my gosh.
Well,
It was his birthday yesterday, George.
Holy cow. Yeah, it doesn't say Manitoba's golden age of wrestling. That's
close enough.
the same. It's the same age, guys.
Well, Soda, send me a note and I'll get you taken care of.
Oh, definitely will. Thank you
I'll
very
even
much.
prove I can write and sign it for you.
Wow.
Oh, dude, that's awesome. Thank you very much.
All right,
Snark,
we'll talk outside this episode.
you got it. Snark, where can everybody find you?
You can find me. I have a show on YouTube Tuesdays called Have You Seen This? We talk things happening in television, not just the Marvel-y stuff. We talk about whatever we feel like we've been watching. If you're a part of the LGR patronage, I have a show on their Patreon now every Saturday. And some other things coming up. I seem to be popping up on these shows quite a bit, so I'm never quite sure where I'm going to be ending up next. I believe I'll be talking Doctor Who at some point and possibly doing something again with our friend Ben. So just keep watching YouTube. I'm eventually going to pop up, it looks like.
And Dustin, of course, my co-host. What about
Yeah,
you?
you can find me Twitter, Dustin Dubuque, where I complain about AEW and WWE all the time, but I love it anyway. Yeah, you can find me. I think Snark and I have a show to do in a couple of weeks for the halfway point of Survivor.
That's true.
We did Snark, myself, and a couple others did a Survivor fantasy draft, and I'm happy to tell you that of my 4 players, 2 of them were the first vote outs of the season. So I'm rolling. I did a great job. So we have to do that coming up soon. I also think I'm doing some stuff with Ben. So like he said, we'll be popping up a little bit. And then who knows, if you keep watching our show and pay attention to what Soda and I are doing wrestling-wise, there could be some more fun new stuff coming down the pike. So that's where you can find me. What about you, Soda?
So Soda _the_Saxman on Instagram and Twitter. You can find me all over the Northern Entertainment Group Network here. Next show is tomorrow night, where myself and my friend Ben Rayner, we're going to be talking Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And then the next time you'll see me after that is Saturday morning on Northern Countdown here, and then Saturday afternoon on the Let's Get Ready Network on the Drop Kicks, where myself and Dagan just go over some of the news and the week in wrestling and what have you. And we have a lot of fun over there. And you can also find me on their network competing in the movie, the Wrestling Trivia Brawl, where I put my title on the line. That was actually a pretty fun match. Go check those out over on the Let's Get Ready Network. So on behalf of myself, Snark, Dustin, and our special guest, George Shire, thank you very much. And we will see you next week between the ropes on the Squared Slice. Have a good evening, folks, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, guys.
Yes.